Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. You ready to get into this one?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. So this one is about coincidences. I feel like this is something that we all sort of like think about every now and then when something weird happens. But we're going to be looking at a Vsauce video that explores this whole idea of like what are coincidences
hmm
and are they just like random things that happened, or is there something else to it?
Right.
So I'm really curious to like hear your take on some of these things.
Yeah, definitely. This is a cool one
Yeah.
because it kind of, it's got psychology, it's got a little bit of probability in it, even a little bit of pop culture.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, uh, the video starts off by talking about like hidden messages. Like the idea that if you were to reverse audio of like famous quotes or songs, you might hear like these eerie messages.
Right.
Do you remember like that whole thing about like reversing Neil Armstrong's
Yeah.
moon landing quote and it's
Yeah.
saying like man will spacewalk?
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, I don't know like how much I buy into that, but it's still like kind of creepy.
It's interesting, right? Because it plays into like
Yeah.
the idea of like what are called phonetic palindromes, words or phrases that sound the same forward and backward.
Okay.
But it also highlights how like our brains are constantly searching for patterns,
Yeah.
even when they might not be intentionally placed there.
It's kind of like those optical illusions where you see like the hidden image if you look at it a certain way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like our brains are just like wired to seek out patterns and meaning, even in like random noise.
Yeah.
And this tendency is actually called apophenia.
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 All right, I'm adding that to my vocabulary. Have you ever like experienced this yourself?
Of course, yeah.
What kind of things?
Seeing faces in the clouds, right? Or like hearing your name called out in a crowd when nobody actually said it.
Oh yeah, that's happened to me.
Yeah.
But so basically like our brains are always trying to connect the dots, even if the dots aren't really there.
Mm.
So why is it that our brains would evolve to do that?
That's a great question.
I mean, wouldn't that be kind of a disadvantage?
Well, actually, from like an evolutionary perspective,
Huh.
it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Imagine our ancestors out in the wild. If they mistook a rustle in the bushes for a predator,
Mm-hmm.
even if it was just the wind, they were more likely to survive than someone who ignored the potential danger.
Oh, I see. It's like better safe than sorry.
Exactly. So our brains are kind of like hardwired to err on the side of caution,
Yeah.
even if it means seeing patterns where there aren't any.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I can see that. Makes a lot of sense.
And this tendency can have some interesting effects, especially when it comes to technology.
Oh, really? Like what?
The video mentions how people complained about Apple's iTunes Shuffle feature being too random.
Wait, so people were complaining that the shuffle was too random?
Yeah.
I want to hear about this.
Well, it turns out our brains crave patterns and predictability. When things are truly random, it can feel like jarring and unnatural to us. And so Apple actually had to make their Shuffle feature less random
Oh,
by tweaking the algorithm to make it feel more random to users.
wow. So they had to actually program it to be less random.
Yeah.
So that it felt more random to the users.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That's true.
So even like companies like Apple are taking our need for patterns
Yeah.
into account when they're designing their products.
Right.
It makes you wonder like how much of like our perception of randomness is actually being manipulated all the time.
It's a really interesting point, and it highlights how much our expectations and biases can shape our experiences, even when it comes to something as seemingly objective as random.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I never thought about that. The video also talks about those videos where people sync up like music
Right.
with movies or animations.
Yeah.
Like that classic one with the dancing Spider-Man.
Yeah.
That seems to work with any song you throw at it. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
seems like magic.
It's really cool, but it's a great example of how
Mm-hmm.
our brains can find connections even when they're not intentionally placed there.
Okay, so is it not actually magic?
Well, a lot of these animations use common musical tempos and rhythms, making them more likely to sync up with a variety of songs.
Okay, but it still feels pretty cool when like those moments happen.
Yeah.
Of like synchronization.
Absolutely.
It's like you found the hidden message.
Right. And
Yeah.
that's because our brains are really good at filling in the gaps and creating a narrative
Yeah.
that fits our expectations.
Okay.
It's called the law of near enough. Our brains don't need perfect alignment to see a connection.
Oh, interesting. So our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world around us,
Yeah.
even if it means bending the rules a little bit.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I like that.
And that brings us to the role of cognitive biases, which are essentially mental shortcuts that our brains use to process information more quickly.
Okay, cognitive biases. Can you give me an example? I'm
Yes.
not sure I totally get it.
One example is selection bias,
Okay.
which is the tendency to focus on the confirming instances of something while ignoring the ones that don't fit the pattern.
Like if you believe in astrology, you might only remember the times your horoscope was accurate and forget about all the times it was wrong.
Oh, so you like cherry pick the evidence that supports your beliefs and ignore the evidence that contradicts them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this ties into another cognitive bias called confirmation bias, which is the tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms our existing beliefs. And this is a big reason why things like the Wizard of Oz Dark Side of the Moon sink seem so compelling to some people.
Okay. So are you saying that if you believe those things, that it's all just because of your cognitive biases?
Not necessarily. It's important to remember that everyone has cognitive biases. It's a natural part of how our brains work.
Okay.
But being aware of these biases can help us be more critical thinkers and avoid jumping to conclusions based on limited evidence.
Right. So it's like you need to develop a healthy skepticism,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to things that seem too good to be true.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that skepticism can actually make the exploration of coincidences even more fascinating. It allows us to appreciate the mystery and wonder without falling prey to unfounded claims or misinterpretations.
Okay, I like that. This is all making me think about like my own experiences with coincidences in a whole new light. I'm starting to realize that maybe those seemingly impossible connections aren't so impossible after all.
And that's one of the things that makes the study of coincidences so compelling. It forces us to question our assumptions about the world and to consider alternative explanations for things that might seem inexplicable at first glance.
I can't wait to dive even deeper into this. This is turning out to be a real eye-opener.
We'll get ready because we're just getting started. We still have a
Yeah.
lot more to uncover about the nature of coincidences, and I think you're going to find it incredibly thought-provoking.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, okay, so we've been talking about how our brains love to find patterns and how that can lead us to see coincidences even where they might not exist. But what about those times when the coincidences seem so unbelievable that it's hard to just chalk it up to our perception?
Well, that's where the fascinating world of probability comes in. You know, it's easy to forget that in a world of billions of people, with countless events happening every second, the odds of some pretty strange things happening aren't as astronomically small as we might think.
So you're saying that, even though something might seem like a 1 in a million chance, if you factor in the sheer volume of events happening, it's actually more likely to occur than we initially assume.
Exactly. There's actually a mathematical principle called Littlewood's law that helps illustrate this point. It basically calculates the probability of seemingly improbable events happening based on how often we're exposed to potential events in our daily lives.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you break that down for me a little more? How does this Littlewood's law actually work? Sure. Imagine you're awake for about 16 hours a day, and something with a 1 in a million chance of happening takes just 1 second to occur. According to Littlewood's law, you could theoretically experience this 1 in a million event every 35 days.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing.
Right.
So even those incredibly rare events aren't necessarily as rare as we might think, especially when you consider the vastness of time
Yeah.
and the sheer number of people on the planet.
Exactly. And a statistician named David J. Hand even wrote a book called The Improbability Principle, where he explores this concept in depth. He argues that when you take into account the vastness of human experience, unusual events are actually quite common.
So maybe those stories we hear about people winning the lottery twice
Yeah.
or getting struck by lightning multiple times aren't as miraculous as they seem. They're just a product of probability playing out on a grand scale.
That's a great way to put it. It's like flipping a coin. The more times you flip it, the more likely you are to get a long streak of heads or tails. It's not magic, it's just the laws of probability at work.
But surely there are some coincidences that go beyond just simple probability.
Right. What about those cases where the connections seem too specific, too eerie to just be random chance?
Well, even in those cases, it's important to remember the power of our perception and how easily our brains can connect the dots, even when the dots aren't really related. Take the famous coincidences between Presidents Lincoln and Kennedy, for example.
Oh, yeah. That's one I've always found fascinating. It's pretty wild how many similarities there are in their lives and deaths. It seems almost too strange to be just a coincidence.
Right. It's definitely a compelling story. But when you break down those coincidences, they're actually more common than you might think.
Hmm.
Many of the similarities are fairly general, and when you consider how many presidents there have been, it's statistically probable that some of them would share a few characteristics.
So you're saying that if we looked hard enough, we could probably find equally amazing coincidences between other pairs of presidents. Exactly. In fact, the Skeptical Inquirer magazine actually held a contest where they challenged people to find such coincidences, and the results were pretty impressive. Participants found all sorts of intriguing connections between other pairs of presidents, showing that these patterns aren't as unique as they might initially seem.
That's a really good point. It's like we tend to focus on the extraordinary and ignore the mundane, even though the mundane is what makes the extraordinary possible.
It's like finding shapes in the clouds. Our brains are wired to seek out familiar patterns, even if they're not really there. And when it comes to coincidences, that tendency can lead us to see connections that might not actually exist.
So the next time I encounter a seemingly impossible coincidence, I should maybe take a step back and consider the role of probability, my own perception and the vastness of the world around me, before jumping to any conclusions.
Absolutely. Remember, what seems meant to be might just be the inevitable result of time numbers and a
Uh,
dash of cognitive bias.
It's like that old saying, coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. Maybe it's not about some divine intervention,
Yeah.
but rather the beauty of randomness in our own minds trying to make sense of it all.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? That even in a world seemingly governed by chaos, there's an underlying order, a set of rules that govern even the most improbable events.
It is. Makes you feel small and insignificant, yet somehow connected to something much larger than yourself.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about how all these seemingly random events and connections just weave together to create the tapestry of our lives.
hmm
It makes you wonder if maybe there is something more to these coincidences than meets the eye.
I think that's a question that's fascinated humans for centuries. And while we may never have a definitive answer, the exploration itself can be incredibly enriching. It challenges us to expand our thinking and consider different perspectives
Hmm.
on the nature of reality.
Speaking of different perspectives, the Vsauce video mentions
Mm.
this woman who draws faces on all her belongings.
Oh, yeah. She says that it makes them less likely to get lost because it taps into our natural inclination to recognize faces.
I love that example. It's such a clever example of how we can actually harness our cognitive biases and use them to our advantage. It's like she's hacking her own brain's pattern recognition system.
Right. It's like those find the hidden object puzzles.
Hmm.
Once you see the face, it's almost impossible to unsee it.
Exactly.
Yeah. It makes you wonder what other ways we could be using our understanding of these biases to improve our lives.
It's a fascinating area of research for sure, and I think it speaks to the power of understanding how our minds work. The more we learn about our cognitive processes, the better equipped we are to navigate the world around us.
So should we just dismiss all coincidences as tricks of the mind? Or is there room for a little bit of wonder and mystery in our lives?
I think it's important to strike a balance. We should absolutely be critical thinkers and avoid jumping to conclusions based on limited evidence. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with embracing a sense of awe and curiosity when we encounter those seemingly impossible connections.
It's like that quote by Carl Jung. Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see.
Oh, I love that one.
Maybe it's not about proving or disproving the existence of something beyond our understanding, but rather just being open to the possibility, the mystery.
That's beautifully put. I think it's about acknowledging that there are things in this universe that we may never fully comprehend. And that's okay. In fact, it's what makes life so fascinating.
All right, so next time you find yourself face to face with a jaw-dropping coincidence, take a moment to consider all the factors at play. Is it a random occurrence, a product of your own perception, or something more? The answer might surprise you.
And even if you can't explain it, don't let that diminish the sense of wonder. Let it spark your curiosity. Let it fuel your exploration of the world and the intricate workings of your own mind.
Well, this deep dive has been a wild ride. We've gone from hidden messages to the psychology of randomness to the very nature of coincidence itself. What stands out to you the most? Let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts and your personal experiences with those wait, what are the chances moments.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep your eyes open for those fascinating glimpses into the interconnectedness of it all. You never know what seemingly impossible connections you might uncover.